This is Voicemail, the Universal Postal Union's podcast covering the wonderful world of mail. I'm your host, Ian Kerr. In this episode, we're joined by historian Dr. Léonard Labourie. He's from the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, and he'll share a historical perspective of the UPU, multilateralism, and the postal world. Joining me on the line is Dr. Léonard Labourie. He's historian at the National Centre for Scientific Research. Welcome. Let's start with the question that we ask all of our guests on the UPU Voicemail podcast. Tell us, what was your first memory of the post?
Good question. Thanks, Ian, for asking. Well, spontaneously, I would say the stamp collection that I started around 10, when I was 10 years old. But maybe if I reflect more on this, I can add the bills, the utility bills that my mother used to receive, and it was not always a good news, it caused some trouble at home. So that's another dimension of my postal memory.
Nobody really looks forward to receiving a bill, I suppose. Let's talk about your academic career then. In your academic career, how did you get to focus on communications and transport? What sort of triggered your interest in this as a researcher?
I engaged in research just when the internet and the mobile phones get popularized in Europe. Was at the end of the 1990s. And exploring the past of communication networks that were just revolutionizing our day-to-day life was extremely appealing for the master student that I was. And I was intrigued in particular on the international aspect of this revolution. You could send an email to anyone connected, whatever his location on the planet. You could use your mobile phone wherever in Europe and beyond. So I asked myself, who were the actors and institutions that made this possible? Were there precedents? And I soon realized that the mail and the post were forerunners of this global connectivity, together with the telegraph in the 19th century already. And also realized that the Universal Postal Union should be a key site of research for anyone interested in the history of the governance of cross-border communication flows. The ground program of the Committee for the History of La Poste in France helped me to realize this. This to say that when there is a ground to promote a field of research, it has some effects. And well, in my case, it drove me to this topic too.
Well, and how did posts and telecommunications become a testing ground for the very first sprouts of multilateralism at the end of the 19th century?
The answer is usually that this was the logical or even technological thing to do, since communications networks are designed to communicate and their usefulness increases with the number of points connected. It was more rational and economical to establish standards and general agreements than a series of bilateral provisions. And indeed, it's what happened. Bilateral agreements between neighboring countries gradually gave way to multilateral agreements. And the communication sector was the first to give rise to a global and lasting organization of relations between states. We can say that with the Universal Postal Union and a few years before the International Telegraph Union, we have the origin of the global governance of globalisation itself. But historians show that the path was not predetermined. It was not so direct to go from the bilateral to the multilateral setting. The agreements that were reached these years, we speak about the 1860s, 1870s, beared the mark of the context in which they were drawn. For instance, you can find pleas already in the 1850s for the abolition of transit fees, for the setting of a common universal rate. But it took almost 25 years to get there, to have the founding convention that established the Universal Postal Union signed. So the way was not direct. This is one point to keep in mind. If you look at the details then, if you look at the convention in the detail, you find that the negotiations between postal officers and diplomats shaped and changed the agreements over time in multiple ways on various issues such as common rates, voting rights, etc., etc. You will find a lot of negotiation, tensions, and evolutions. So nothing predetermined.
How did the world change after the foundation of these first international organisations, and did they fulfil their intended purpose like immediately and indeed over time?
Difficult to say. The world did not change overnight because of this new way to rule over international postal or telegraphic relations. The convention founding the UPU in 1874 did not change the world overnight. But contemporaries acknowledge the importance of this organization. Unsurprisingly, this is true from the postal officers and the other delegates who signed the convention and who managed the institution that resulted from it. But it proved also to be the case from a larger group of experts in international law, journalists, politicians who truly considered this organization, the UPU, the Telegraph Union, to be the greatest political innovation of the time. First, because they simply made international communications easier. It was indeed cheaper and safer than ever before to send or receive a letter across borders. And flows did not only increase significantly after the creation of the UPU, they also diversified with samples of merchandise, commercial papers, newspapers, and later on even postcards, parcel posts, money orders being included in these postal services. So you see the significance of change brought about by the Universal Postal Union. This increase and diversification followed and allowed at the same time one of the most intense period of human mobility. At the end of the 19th century, so 150 years ago, millions of people moved around the planet for shorter or longer stays abroad. The circulation was even more intense than today in proportion. And communicating from abroad, receiving or sending news, samples of merchandise, etc., was part and parcel of this big move around the planet, with mass migration and an intensification of global commerce. I have mentioned the letter, the postcard, etc., etc. But you can find services that have disappeared since then, and which illustrate this need for denser communication across borders with the phonopost, for instance. The phonopost, I don't know if you know about that, was a service that allowed you to register a gramophone, a disc in the post office, and to send it with a special rate abroad so that your correspondent could hear, not read, but hear you. So this was before international telephony. Well, it was not at the end of the 19th century, but more in the 20s, 30s of the 20th century that this kind of service emerged. We don't know that much about this service. There is certainly research to be done on these past international communication practices.
Let's talk a bit about the UPU and the UN. So the adhesion of the UPU to the United Nations in 1948 changed the UPU's role and position in the world in any way? I mean, do you think it was natural even for the UPU to join the UN? And do you have any comments on how being part of the UN system impacts the mission of the UPU and the way it operates?
Joining the UPU, I've done research on that, and I can say joining the UPU was not natural at all. The UPU became a specialized agency of the United Nations system in November 1947. Before that, postal administrations and the host of the International Bureau, Switzerland, had made sure not to include the UPU as part of the League of Nations, the United Nations predecessor, which was founded just after the First World War in 1990. And this in spite of some pressure to include the UPU and other international unions into the frame of the League of Nations. The reason for this resistance was to keep international politics outside of postal cooperation as far as possible. In other words, to immunize the UPU from diplomatic tensions. And indeed, in the 1930s, Germany, USSR, and other countries had left the League of Nations, but they remain active members of the UPU. So this design proved effective, efficient. But after the Second World War, it was no longer possible for the postal administrations, the members of the UPU and Switzerland, to further resist being included in the larger framework. So the UPU was isolated, and it wanted to be isolated until the 1940s, and became part of the UN in 45, 47. People and the founding members of the United Nations wanted to make it stronger than the League. And one way to make the UN stronger was to include these international organizations that were already there. And the UPU was one of these. The nations had to be united by all means to prevent war, cultivate peace, and to solve common social and economic issues. This inclusion was the matter of harsh negotiations. How far should the UPU be dependent on the UN? How far the rules of the UN should apply to the UPU was a much contested issue. For instance, there were some countries that were banned from the UN, like Spain. Spain could not join the UN at the beginning, Franco Spain. But it was part of the UPU. So how to deal with this? And an agreement was found, and to sum it up, it created a very loose connection between the UPU and the UN. So in principle, the UPU was a specialized agency, but if you look in the detail, the relation is kept loose. So Spain could stay in the UPU even if it was not part of the UN. The UPU had to report at some point to the UN, but not that more. So joining the UN was a change, it had some implication in the long term, but in the short term, it didn't change that much, the mission and the way the UPU functioned. Good example is technical assistance, for instance. Up until the early 1960s, the UPU barely participated to the UN Technical Assistance Program. And it was later on that the UPU became more involved in this scheme.
You mentioned earlier about the UN's role in peace and conflict prevention. In your opinion, what does the role of technical international organisations like the UPU have in times of conflict and war? Can you share any examples?
Well, first, I must acknowledge that we historians have little studied international organizations during wartime. This because international organizations were intended to foster cooperation and to prevent conflict, more than to deal with conflict. So war is primarily viewed as a failure of this system, of the international organization. But this does not mean that UPU and other international organizations ceased their operation during wars, of course. Because it was based in neutral Switzerland, the International Bureau of the UPU was able to carry on some basic tasks during the First and the Second World War. In both conflicts, Switzerland and the International Bureau of the UPU played a key role in enabling the free postage to and from prisoners of war and later on to civilian internees. This proved a key role in times of war for this organization. But so far, the neutralization of postal channels, that is the free access to postal transit through belligerent countries, never took shape. It was something asked for, argued for, but it never took shape. So the post is not neutral when there is a war.
The UPU will hold its first Historians Colloquium this year. It's taking place in a few weeks' time in Bern, in fact. And the theme is Achieving a Single Postal Territory, a Global Promise, Past and Present. So looking back, do you think the UPU has fully delivered on the global promise of its creators?
Article 1 of the treaty that later became a convention, that's international law, but Article 1 says indeed the members intend to create or to form together a single postal territory. And this meant that there was an obligation to process international mail, and including transit mail. That was the big thing. Processing transit mail became an obligation, and also the founding treaty set the goal of having one single uniform and relatively cheap rate for international postage. And the members and the UPU, they did achieve this. That's big enough, I would say. That's a true achievement. They have delivered since then. At the same time, though, we have to keep in mind that uniformity, if this makes sense, was never fully achieved, never total. For instance, the uniform rate for sending a letter abroad, whatever the destination, whatever the place where you send it from, was replaced after World War I by a more flexible scheme with one common rate in principle, but the possibility to deviate from it. You can also find special agreements for some international services not offered or accepted everywhere in the Universal Postal Union. So one of the first special agreements between a certain number of members was for money orders. Another one was for parcel post. So you see no global uniformity, something more nuanced. And the other key idea behind the Universal Postal Union was the abolition of international accounting between administrations. This to facilitate the relations, to simplify. The limit was that transit fees were never abolished. So as many militated for, but at the end, transit fees were never abolished. So transiting mail is an obligation, but not free of charge. And for this reason, the single postal territory was not synonymous with the total suppression, abolition of international accounting between postal administration.
Just returning to the UPU historians colloquium being held in Bern, what do you hope this colloquium will bring to light?
The colloquium will take place, in a few weeks, beginning of February, to, mark the anniversary of the foundation of the UPU, under the slogan 150 years of enabling communication and empowering people across nations. That's the slogan for the whole year of celebration. And I hope that the colloquium will critically assess if and how the UPU and its members empowered communities across countries and years. And in general, I hope this meeting will bring to light what this impressive figure, 150 years, what this figure could obscurate. I mean, the fragilities. The UPU has a long story, but has always been, in a way, with its weaknesses. I hope to see also the contingencies, the evolutions, the negotiated nature of postal cooperation. So, contrary to the idea of a predetermination of postal cooperation being a given, hey, look at this long history. It was natural. It has always been there. I hope to show that the UPU has never been outside history, and history is made of negotiations, tensions, contest, conflict. Even when we look at cooperation, we have to consider how it was a way to mitigate conflict, to overcome conflict. Conflict is still and always there. In general, participants will bring multiple perspectives on this. We will learn from the foundational period for sure, but not only from a European perspective, as much of the founders were postal administrations located in Europe, but we will also have the view from Turkey, Japan, China, countries that early on joined the UPU and why they joined, how they joined. And this based on archives from these countries. We will raise the question of the politics of postal cooperation, how the UPU both contributed to stabilizing, naturalizing a colonial order, and became, on the other hand, a site where to contest this order. We will also contribute to, I hope, historicizing philately as a cultural practice and discover how the coordinated fight against fraud gave birth to public global stamp collections across the world. We'll also deal with the standardization of the envelope. So we will go deep into the standardization process. Yes, there was interesting debates in the 60s how to standardize the envelope itself. And that's maybe a last example of what we will discuss during the conference. We will learn from the 1980s debates on the rise of electronic mail. The UPU was a place where postal administrations dealt with this emerging phenomenon, practice, emailing. And yes, we will go back to the early days of email through postal debates. Until then, the UPU has reflected on its past alone. With a few exceptions, the UPU history has been written by the UPU itself, if you see what I mean. And this on the occasion of a few landmark anniversaries. The first anniversary was the 25th anniversary that was celebrated, and it came along with an history of the organization. And this is the first time when the UPU opens itself to professional historians on this kind of event. And I am grateful, I must say, to the Director General of the International Bureau, Mr. Metoki, and to his team, including his Director of Cabinet, Mr. Boussard, for their support and openness. That's new. And I hope that this attitude will generate, conversely, more interest from the academic community on this topic. It's only a start. This conference is only a start, and there is much more to be done on the history of the UPU.
So a milestone anniversary is also an opportunity to look forward as well. I mean, you just mentioned the occasional fragility of international organizations, and some might also say that anything that's precious can also be fragile. Anyway, enough of the philosophy from me. What I'm really trying to ask is, what do you see in the future for the UPU? I mean, do you think we'll make it to 200 years? And how do you see the evolution of the UPU and the global postal network going forward, especially in light of what you just said with regard to things like the emergence of email and alternative means of communication?
Well, first of all, the historian is not the good one or the best place to look and predict any kind of future for sure. But what I can say is that the history of the UPU was made mainly by public postal operators with the support of their governments and around a key service, a key object even, the letter. Now, the postal sector is faced with a decline in letter traffic, which depends and varies along the regions in the world, and the rise of parcels, which is also the business of other operators. So to me, the future of the UPU is about accommodating with these trends, taking into account another disruptive factor you often deal with in your podcast, Ian, being artificial intelligence. This is another issue for the future, another component of the future. So I believe that postal operators can better face these challenges together than separated. So my take on this would be that out of necessity, but also due to the social political role of postal operators and services in the fabric and maintenance of territorial polities, I foresee a 200th anniversary in 2074 for the UPU. I think there is strong arguments and factors that should enable the UPU to further strive and develop.
Dr. Leonard Laborie, historian at the National Centre for Scientific Research, thank you very much for joining us on the UPU Voicemail podcast today. You've been listening to Voicemail, the official podcast of the Universal Postal Union. Subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and you'll get each episode downloaded to the device of your choosing as it's released. My thanks to the team at the UPU for their help putting together this episode. I'm your host, Ian Kerr, and I look forward to your company next time on Voicemail, the podcast of the UPU.